Welcome back everyone to my second video of my channel. I wanted to discuss a little bit about inflation, more specifically the nuances of inflation, because I think a lot of people misunderstand it and misrepresent it and how it started and how it's brought out through the economy. So let's start off with just the basics of inflation. Essentially, inflation is when you have a relative high demand to supply ratio. So the demand is high relative to supply. So that can happen by either demand increasing because there are more people going after a product, or it can happen because there are the same amount of people, but you have more spending power per person because maybe they're wealthier or maybe they've gotten printed money from the government or something. But it can also happen from the other side of the equation where you have the supply going down. So essentially, inflation is when the supply to demand ratio changes such that the demand has more power than the supply. So with that said, when money is imprinted into the economy, a lot of people think that it immediately just causes inflation at a 1-to-1 ratio. But this isn't really true. I think this is missing a few different things. And I wanted to start off with why this is happening. And it's because various different reasons, but one large one is because when you have items that have a different supply elasticity, then it affects inflation in different ways. So, for example, a good and service that has a very elastic supply would be software. Maybe not necessarily all software, but let's take the Microsoft Windows operating system, for example. So Windows, let's just say, or Microsoft, let's just say, sells 100,000 units of their operating system per month. And then all of a sudden there's more demand for that, for the software. So now instead of 100,000 every month, it's 500,000. Well, Microsoft doesn't really have to do as much to meet that new level of demand because software is easily replicatable. So you can just easily copy it from the source to the consumer's machines relatively easy. It's just a matter of downloading and installing the software. Maybe there are some other things in the background that need to happen in terms of Microsoft may need to hire more customer service representatives or maybe set up a few new servers or something. But overall, it is fairly straightforward to bring on more supply when the demand increases. And that way, the price stays relatively constant. So that would be an example of a product with a very elastic supply because the supply can kind of flow with the demand. If the demand increases, the supply increases and vice versa. A good with a less elasticity would be apples, for example. Apples are a product with a less elastic supply than software because let's say the demand for apples is 100,000, or let's say a farm's demand for apples is 100,000 apples per season. And then all of a sudden the demand goes up to 500,000 apples per season. Whether it's the same amount of people buying more apples or is just more people in general buying the apples, it doesn't really matter. But let's just say that there's now 500,000 apples needing to be sold from this one farm and they only have 100,000. Well, because of this, prices are going to increase and the farmers will most likely go and buy more land or go and attempt to plant more apple trees so that the next year they can have more supply on hand to meet that extra demand. However, there's a lag in between this. So if you have an increase in demand, it's going to take several months or a year, maybe even multiple years before you actually see supply increase to meet that level of demand. And because of this, the price of these apples will likely go up at first because again, if you're asking for 500,000 apples from this farm and they only have 100,000, the price is going to go up to the highest bidder and then they're only going to be able to sell the 100,000 apples that they have. But we should note that the price of apples haven't really risen in the last 50, 100 years. It's stayed relatively the same. And I can show you a chart later of this. But the reason why, or at least the reason from an economic standpoint, would be because there's not necessarily an increase in demand for apples. So let's say the government goes and prints money and hands out the money to all the people in its country. Well, people are more likely to go and want to buy things that they want or they feel like they need. Apples, you can only eat so many apples, for example, or gallons of milk could be another less elastic product or a product with a less elastic supply. You can only drink so much milk. And if you store apples or if you store milk, it can only be stored so long before it goes bad. So there's really no point of going out if you have more money and spending all that new money on apples and milk. But you may want to spend it on housing, or you may want to spend it on used cars, or you may want to spend it on Bitcoin or something, you know. And because of this, I don't think the price for these items, for the apples and milk, will go up often when you have newly printed money introduced into the economy. This is something that I don't think really a lot of people understand. They see the government goes and prints money and hands it out to citizens of its country. And then they expect that, you know, prices of everything is going to rise at a 1-to-1 ratio at the same level of money that's been created into the economy. So, for example, if we create 40% of the money supply in 2 years, you can expect inflation to go up by 40% in the next few years. But this isn't actually correct because, again, inflation affects different things at different rates. And so you can sort of see this if you look back in 2020, 2021, 2022. Inflation in general, or at least the CPI in general, rose significantly, at least from a historical standpoint in the US and other Western countries. But prices for other goods and services that people somewhat necessarily don't want more of, like apples or milk, didn't really rise that much. Maybe they rose some, I'm not denying that, but they didn't rise as much as you would expect. They didn't rise as much as housing or vehicles rose. And I think this goes back to, again, people have more money, but they don't necessarily want to spend that money on apples and milk. This brings me to the third thing, and this is goods with a very inelastic supply. So this would be Bitcoin, this would be real estate, this could be gold. These things are very, very difficult to create more of, if not outright impossible. So there's only so much gold on the earth, and maybe you can mine gold from some other planet or something, but that's not really an option right now. Bitcoin, you can only have 21 million, there will never be more than 21 million. Real estate, you might be able to buy more houses or build more houses, but you're not going to be building more land. There's only a set amount of land in the world. And so when you go and you spend this newly created money on these things, you're much more likely to see the price of these things increase relative to the last two goods and services I mentioned. For example, the apples, the milk, or software. Now, something else that I think people misunderstand is the M2 growth and how it is related to inflation. So M2 is basically the money in the economy that is somewhat easily spent. So your savings account, your checking account, your cash in your back pocket is all considered within M2, money supply. But the equity in your home is not, because it's not as easily spent, I guess, for a very simplistic definition of M2. And for the last few years, you've seen M2 money supply really increase at a parabolic rate. And you've also seen inflation come up at a fairly high rate as well. And so a lot of people conflate the two and they just think, oh, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. We're going to see inflation rise as much as M2 growth has from a percentage standpoint. But this isn't necessarily true, because it doesn't necessarily matter how much money you print, but where it's going. For example, back in the 1800s, we were on the gold standard, and you could not create more gold, but you could create more dollars backed by gold by having a fractional reserve system set up. But regardless, the point is that M2 growth in the 1800s actually rose while you had a gold standard. But inflation, or at least the CPI, did not rise. So this is one of the many examples that you'll see where inflation is relatively the same, or at least inflation as the CPI measures it is relatively the same or stagnant, but M2 growth has gone up. So because of this, I don't really think that necessarily all printed money is a bad thing. I think in general, it's probably best that we stay away from that, but not necessarily because it's introducing new money into the economy, but that it's because the government is not necessarily very good at determining where that newly created money goes. So for example, if we have M2 at this level, and then the government goes and creates, or the Federal Reserve Central Bank goes and creates $100 more of money and injects it into the economy. Well, if that $100 goes and buys Bitcoin, well, it will probably bid up the price of Bitcoin. And this is an oversimplification of it, but you get the point. However, if that $100 goes and funds a startup that innovates a more efficient way to ship goods and services or goods across oceans, then in aggregate, in the whole world, you might actually see prices decline some rather than rise from that $100 because it went to fund something that actually created more deflation than that $100 could create in inflation. So if you like this video, please hit the subscribe button, give it a like, let me know your thoughts in the comments, preferably your reasoning, and I will see you in the next video.